So, with Giancarlo Esposito cast as Sidewinder in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and us also getting the Serpent Society, a lot of you guys have been asking me the question, who are these guys? And you've been asking me to make a video on who these guys are. So, the cool thing about Sidewinder and the Serpent Society is you don't have to do separate videos. The two go hand in hand. And in fact, they're basically a Mark Grunwald thing. And I'll explain what that means as we go further into this video. The downside to this is there's not a lot doing there. They were very much a byproduct of the late 1970s and really the 1980s. And by the time you get to Captain America 424, they're essentially done, right? They just kind of pop up here and there from time to time and they have no real significance. So Sidewinder and the Serpent Society originally debuted in Marvel Comics in what was called the Serpent Crown affair, which happened between Marvel 2-in-1 issue 65 running up to 67. And for those of you guys who are unfamiliar about Marvel 2-in-1, this was a line of comics that was immensely popular because of the popularity of the Thing Ben Grimm. That what the comic did is it would have Ben Grimm team up with someone, whether that was a character that Marvel was bringing back in an effort to like drum up interest in them, potentially for a solo series, or for the introduction of a new character changed from one issue to the next. But in this particular instance, Sidewinder and the Serpent Squad, as they were known at the time, emerged as a result of Ben Grimm and the character he was teaming up with named Stingray showing up to an oil derrick. The reason for this was because, one, they were supposed to be meeting with the Inhumans. I don't know why, the Inhumans are trash, nobody wants to hang out with them. But the second reason is because Stingray was an oceanographer, and so just seeing a oil derrick out in where it's not supposed to be didn't really make a whole lot of sense, because there was no oil in the area where the oil derrick was at. And so what ends up going on here is when they arrive on the scene, they're immediately attacked by the staff of the oil derrick, and this is done for two reasons. The first is because the staff are actually employees of Roxxon Oil. And the second is because the arrival of Ben Grimm and Stingray coincide with a series of explosions taking place in the bottom of the oil derrick, which leads the staff to believe that Ben Grimm and Stingray are trying to blow it up. And so after an initial skirmish between these guys, Sidewinder and the Serpent Society emerge and declare their desire to locate the Serpent Crown. Now, as a little bit of a sidetrack here, the Serpent Crown is an incredibly powerful artifact in Marvel Comics, but it's not powerful due to its existence. It's powerful because of what it can do. And what I mean by that is, in Marvel Comics, you have what are called the Elder Gods. And I'll talk about what that means here in a second, because that kind of goes into the involvement of Scarlet Witch in this little bit of history for the Serpent Society. But one of the things to know is that a lot of Mark Grunwald's writing was predicated on the popularity of the X-Men, in the sense that Chris Claremont wrote the X-Men as more human than anything else. That's exactly what goes on here, that when the Serpent Society emerges, they basically take it to Ben Grimm and Stingray quite readily. Now, a lot of this is because the roster of the Serpent Society is designed in such a way to where they can kind of hit different heroes in different ways. So for example, the character of Anaconda basically has super strength. And so Anaconda is able to go toe to toe with Ben Grimm. Ultimately, you end up having Death Adder that basically seizes Stingray and then threatens Ben Grimm with death if he doesn't stop, right? And so ultimately, the Serpent Society is able to get the upper hand on Ben Grimm and Stingray, which right off the bat solidified what this team was capable of. The other part of this was like the writing of their statements and things like that. They weren't like, we're going to defeat you, haha, blarg. Instead, they spoke like humans did, which again is one of the reasons why Marvel in the late 1970s and the 1980s was kind of blowing DC Comics out of the water. But the bigger point here is that with Ben Grimm and Stingray essentially neutralized, the intelligence and the capabilities of the Serpent Society come into play when you realize that the way they chained them up was to basically keep them perpetually trapped, in the sense that they're essentially chained to the center of this oil derrick. But because of the way in which they're chained, if Ben Grimm were to just try to rip himself free, he would tear off the arms of Stingray, and Stingray's not strong enough to free himself from the chain. So in essence, they're just going to drown down here. Now, ultimately, of course, they're basically rescued by Triton of the Inhumans, who arrives just in the nick of time because, Comic book logic. And Ben Grimm and Stingray are freed. And what this does is it coincides with the Serpent Society successfully locating the Serpent Crown. Now, one of the things that I want to specify is this is the only time you're ever going to see them associate with the Serpent Crown. The two are not synonymous. It's one of the big misnomers that you have when it comes to these groups in Marvel Comics, or at least this group in Marvel Comics. What follows after the discovery of the Serpent Crown is basically a great big huge fight between Ben Grimm, Stingray, Triton, and like the Serpent Society. It's where you also learn of some of the other things that they can do. A good example of this is that Black Mamba has the ability to manipulate what's called Dark Force energy. By and large, Dark Force energy is just like tangible darkness, right? And so she essentially emits it from herself and then encases it around Ben Grimm. What this does is it allows her to use her abilities of hypnotic suggestion to trick Ben Grimm into seeing somebody who's not there, specifically Alicia, right? Alicia Masters, the woman that he loves. And so it almost allows Black Mamba to drown Ben Grimm. Now, of course, he ends up seeing through the illusion with the aid of Stingray, and ultimately he escapes. But that also leads to the Serpent Society escaping with the Serpent Crown as well. And that's when you get the full totality of what's going on here, because going into issue number 66, what you end up getting is Ben Grimm contacting Agatha Harkness. The reason why was because Agatha Harkness at this point in time in Marvel Comics was the nanny for Franklin Richards of the Fantastic Four, the son of Reed and Susan. But because of her prodigious nature when it came to magic as a legitimate witch, as opposed to somebody like Stephen Strange, who's more of a sorcerer, that Agatha Harkness was able to monitor the powers of Franklin and kind of help the Fantastic Four better understand how his abilities worked. But because of her involvement with the Scarlet Witch, as what was previously the Scarlet Witch's mentor, and because Wanda had previously been involved and actually possessed the Serpent Crown, we get a little bit of a narrative here. Now, one of the things that I want to specify is that this is not the first time Marvel deals with the idea of elder gods and the kind of power that things like the Serpent Crown represent. But with Agatha speaking directly to Wanda, we end up learning that, like, at a future point in time on Earth, you had elder gods. And there were a lot of them, right? Beings like Chthon and so on and so forth. Of course, as we know from other stories that existed in Marvel Comics, that a war broke out among the elder gods. They basically degenerated into evil, tried to kill each other. It was a big civil war. And then most of them were all destroyed. Those who were not destroyed fled into alternate dimensions. It's why Chthon has his dimension and why Sidorak has his dimension and so on and so forth. If you don't know the significance of those names, it's not overly important here. What is important is that one of these elder gods was named Set, and the Serpent Crown is the way in which Set tries to enter into the earthly plane. Those who put on the crown and have no clue what they're dealing with will become vessels for Set. They'll be able to channel his power, but they will become vessels for his essence. And that would, in effect, give Set the ability to arrive on Earth and then start enacting plans to conquer Earth. Now, of course, because of the level of power that different superheroes have when it comes to the Marvel landscape at that point in time, Set would likely, be defeated. Somebody like Chthon would just run rampant. Nobody would be able to destroy him. But guys like Set, he would be defeated quite readily, even if he emerged with full power. The other part of this, and really comes by way of Sidewinder, is you end up learning that they were hired for this job. And they were specifically hired by the head of Roxxon Oil, because Roxxon, always trying to attain huge levels of power and kind of dominate the entire corporate landscape and really even the world, wanted to attain the Serpent Crown for that very purpose. Now, what's interesting about Sidewinder and really the Serpent Society's involvement here is that once the crown is handed over, they're done. They're no longer part of the story, right? Basically, Sidewinder teleports away because he has the ability to teleport every 50 yards due to technology built within his cloak. Following that, the story just turns into a battle between Ben Grimm, Stingray, and Scarlet Witch joining alongside, or at least facing off against, Roxxon. And that's it. Right, that's really all it is. I mean, there's really not a whole lot going there. But for Sidewinder and Serpent Society, kind of keeping this on track, they start reappearing in Captain America comics. It is important to specify that in Fred Van Lente's Iron Man Legacy, there was an instance where Iron Man faced off against Sidewinder and the Serpent Society. It's not overly important, and in fact, this was a story that was released much, much later in the 2000s that was designed to give a little bit of context to Sidewinder. It doesn't really tie into his history. It's not overly meaningful. It is there if anybody were ever interested in reading it. It's actually Iron Man Legacy issues 7 and 8. But for the main seeing Sidewinder and Serpent Society involvement in Captain America, that was really where his character became interesting, because instead of being a villain that Captain America faced off against time and time again, because a lot of this was done based on the framework established through Chris Claremont's X-Men, that the Serpent Society actually existed in the background for quite some time, that a lot of the Captain America comics dealt with the Serpent Society basically building its ranks. And what I mean here is that in Captain America issues 307 and 308, you end up learning by way of, again, background content, that the members of the Serpent Society that were there in Marvel 2-in-1 were supposed to be paid $10,000 each for joining Sidewinder on this mission and successfully attaining the Serpent Crown. Seemingly, Sidewinder never paid them. And so some of them show up to his apartment after figuring out where he lives and confront him with this. And then, of course, he pays them, but he also makes them a deal. He says, if you join me and we form a legitimate Serpent Society, a group of basically snake-themed villains, that we can actually amass a lot more money than this paltry $10,000 that we each get. And so that sets in motion the formation of the Serpent Society itself under the leadership of Sidewinder. In Captain America 310, with Serpents of the World Unite, that we learned that Sidewinder had teleported into prison, grabbed Cobra, teleported him out, and then brought all these serpent-themed villains together. And so on one side, he has Black Mamba, Death Adder, Princess Python, Cottonmouth, and Diamondback. Of course, a lot of those names you'll probably recognize from like the Luke Cage TV show. There's also Bushmaster. Cobra, again, as well, had been teleported here, as well as the Asp and the Rattler, in addition to Anaconda. But the whole idea behind Sidewinder doing this was that by looking at the superhero community, the Avengers, the X-Men, Fantastic Four, and so on, they were always organized and they were always structured. And it didn't make any sense for villains not to operate the same way. And that in fact, by bringing all their resources together and operating as a singular organization, they could actually achieve a lot more success than they could if they fought individually. Because while Anaconda is very, very strong, Anaconda would be useless against somebody like Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, whereas another member of the Serpent Society would stand a better chance. So again, greater than the sum of their parts. The other part of this is that because of the way things were written, it was kind of interesting. It shined Sidewinder in a different light, because he says the benefits of unionization are enormous. Greater access to data and tools, guaranteed pay scale, insurance, medical, and pension plans. And of course, the comradeship of like-minded people. The needs of people like us can be best met by a united front. So again, very human conversation. The other thing about this that was kind of cool is that instead of just like meeting in a dingy basement somewhere, they met in a pretty high-profile place. And the formation of the Serpent Society was almost formed more as a corporation than anything else. Now, the problem with this is you had a guy named Constrictor, and Constrictor actually found a pretty decent amount of success on his own and didn't see a reason to join in with the Serpent Society. And so ultimately he bails. And under normal circumstances, it wouldn't be a great big huge deal. It would just kind of be him out there doing his own thing. The problem is that Constrictor comes to the realization that if the Serpent Society is actually successful and they actually are able to pull off a lot of major heists, it could cut into his criminal activities. So this guy rats him out to the Avengers. He calls the Avengers and tells them like, hey, there's this group that's supposed to be committing these crimes. You may want to go check it out. Now, of course, because this is a Captain America comic, it leads to Captain America's involvement. He, of course, catches up to the Serpent Society in the middle of their crime. And for the most part, it shows us how Captain America handles himself against this group. And he's actually able to do it quite readily. Now, of course, it's not some end-all be-all instance of him crushing everybody quite readily, but it does show that Captain America can hold his own against an organization like this. Of course, the organization ends up learning that Constrictor ratted them out, and so Anaconda shows up and basically beats this guy within an inch of his life, and that's essentially it. But following that, going into Captain America issue number 311, while this comic largely focuses on Steve Rogers fighting Awesome Andy, who was literally an amazing character in Marvel, and I wish they would bring him back, for Sidewinder and the Serpent Society, because of their successful mission, despite the efforts efforts of Captain America, what ends up happening is the organization is tasked with basically offering their resources to a variety of groups that are out there. They appear to the Kingpin, Wilson Fisk, who doesn't really take them overly seriously, but is more curious about them than anything else. Their first real success here, though, actually comes by way of offering their services to Advanced Idea Mechanics for the purpose of capturing MODOK. And the reason why was because MODOK, George Tarleton, was actually created by Advanced Idea Mechanics. And because he basically revolted against the organization and was always trying to destroy them every chance he could, this ultimately led to Advanced Idea Mechanics working with Serpent Society to try to defeat MODOK, bring him back in, and then somehow incapacitate him, which they successfully do, right? They successfully pull it off. And so right off the bat, even if it's only in just little background stories, Mark Grunwald proves quite readily that Serpent Society is incredibly capable. But again, all this kind of coincides with Captain America's own stories himself, right? At this point in time, he's dealing with guys like Flag Smasher, things along those lines. And so because of the efforts of Captain America in dealing with these other villains, it allows the Serpent Society to kind of operate under the radar. But all this really comes to a head in Captain America issue number 313, when you start to see the first real conflict between Captain America and the Serpent Society, where the Serpent Society is successfully able to basically capture and defeat MODOK, but it leads to Captain America going after them. And so once MODOK kind of gets away and so on and so forth, that a second fight breaks out between MODOK and the Serpent Society, Captain America locates them, and then he jumps into the fray and he incapacitates all of them, right? He defeats every single member of the Serpent Society and then leaves them all to be captured and thrown in prison. Now, of course, in Captain America issue number 315, Sidewinder teleports in, he grabs the criminals that were arrested, he teleports out, and because payment from Advanced Idea Mechanics required the body of MODOK as proof of their efforts, they grab MODOK, they teleport to AIM, and they're paid $100,000. And so it's basically proof to the Serpent Society that, like, the plans of Sidewinder can work, or at least that seemed to be the case. Because by the time you get into Captain America 318, Death Adder's killed, right? He's actually murdered. And that kind of begins the downfall of the Serpent Society, where members are systematically being killed off. This storyline actually ran for maybe one more issue going into 319, and then you don't really see or hear from the Serpent Society for quite some time. They don't show back up again for about 20 issues, which is a little over 2 years or so, in Captain America issue number 338 going to 342, and even into 345. The reason why is because during these issues, just kind of calling it 338 to 345, what you end up learning is that Viper, who had long since been a pretty significant villain in Marvel Comics, had learned about the nature of the Serpent Society and intended to take it over. And so what ended up happening is that in 338, Sidewinder had basically been made aware of these other snake-themed criminals that existed out there. And again, in an effort to beef up the scope of the Serpent Society and potentially even take it worldwide, Sidewinder brought them in. And what ends up happening is that by way of them, Viper's able to gain a foothold. And so from 341 to 345, Viper basically orchestrates a coup d'etat against Sidewinder. She literally ousts him, and it leads into a kind of civil war among the members of the Serpent Society. It's not a civil war of any real significance, right? It's like Captain America 3, more of a civil disagreement than anything else. And so that basically leads to Sidewinder being booted from his own team, right? Like literally given the boot. And then he just doesn't show back up again in Marvel Comics for years. In fact, the only real significant things that happened during this point in time is in Uncanny X-Men Annual number 13, for example, with Sidewinder no longer leading the Serpent Society, he's just kind of sent back to committing small-time crimes. And with Captain America issues 371, 379, going into 380 and 381, you learn small things, right? You learn that like he has a sister, you learn that she runs an upscale boutique, different things along those lines, but that's really about it. But this all comes to a head really for his character and not the Serpent Society itself, but for Sidewinder with Captain America issue number 424. Because what you end up learning is that he has a daughter named Amelia, which you had actually learned before all of this. And that because he's trying to go straight and trying to keep himself out of prison, if for only just the sake of his daughter, that his daughter has an illness. The problem is that her insurance lapsed. And so in order for her to be treated, he has to find some kind of extra extra money. And in fact, he does hit up Captain America asking for Captain America's help in raising that money. Captain America turns him down, and so ultimately this leads to Sidewinder just robbing a whole bunch of drug dealers and different things along those lines. And so the storyline of Sidewinder essentially ends when he's effectively confronted by like Captain America and Diamondback. And the deal that Captain America had made was that if Sidewinder had gone straight, if he had handed himself over to the authorities and allowed himself to be put in prison for the crimes that he'd committed, that like Captain America and essentially the Avengers by extension would fund his daughter's surgery. And because there's just no real way for him to make it out of a gunfight with drug dealers in one piece, it leads to him handing himself over to the cops. Now again, there were a few things going on at this point in time. For example, by Captain America 371, you learned that like Diamondback was actually dating Captain America, things along those lines, hence the reason why Captain America and Diamondback teamed up to basically rescue Sidewinder. Now Sidewinder did ultimately return in New Thunderbolts issue number 7, but it wasn't really as like some grand criminal return. It was more just talking about how villains can be reformed. But I do want to specify that between Captain America issue 424 and New Thunderbolts number 7, there were a couple instances where Marvel had characters named Sidewinder that seemingly led the Serpent Society. The reality here is that none of them were Seth Voelker. Seth Voelker was just sitting in the raft the entire time. We never really found out who they were. They never really had any significant meaning. They kind of faded into oblivion, and that was that. But that does seem to throw people off from time to time, so I felt like that was something worth mentioning. But the last thing that I want to say here is that neither Sidewinder nor the Serpent Society had any real meaningful moments in Marvel Comics outside of Captain America 424. The closest you got was the Serpent Society being rebranded to Serpent Solutions under Viper, but like even then it wasn't overly important. The team was something more akin to like the inverse of Heroes for Hire than anything else. They did some odd jobs here and there, but none of them were ever really huge. And they certainly never received any significant traction after what we saw when it came to the Captain America comics and Marvel. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Again, not a whole lot to go on here. The guys had very limited appearances in Marvel. They were never top shelf. It's just a group that existed out there. So I'm curious to see what Marvel does with Sidewinder and the Serpent Society in Captain America Brave New World. But let me know if you have any questions down in the comments, and I will catch you all later. Peace.